to see everyone here today. Excited to give a presentation on this. This is something I'm super passionate about. I spent a lot of my free time on this topic. I probably spent about 1,000 hours studying Bitcoin. But as I said, it might surprise you that a lot of this presentation is not actually about Bitcoin itself. I think that it's really important for someone that doesn't know a lot about Bitcoin. It's important for them to understand why Bitcoin is important. So that's what we're going to start by getting into. So just to start, obviously this is not financial advice, right? So you might want to consider consulting a professional, if you're thinking about getting into Bitcoin. So first and foremost, most people will spend close to 100,000 hours of their life working for money. So 100,000 is more on the upper end of the scale. It might be closer to 80,000 hours for most, but somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 hours of your life is spent working for money. And so, from my perspective, it's really important to spend maybe 100 hours learning what is money, right? So that's what we're going to start with. So what is money? And maybe a better question to ask is, how do we earn money, right? So we're going to work and we're giving our time and our energy, okay? So really money is supposed to represent our time and our energy. Okay, I think that's a pretty easy first step into what is money. And there's many different definitions, but time and energy, this is my favorite one. And so a question that I like to ask is, okay, what if you need to borrow money, okay? And you have two choices for, what you do from there. So you can either pay your money back and close out the loan and everything's okay, or you can default on your debt obligation. Now, the government has a third option that maybe is not super obvious, but let's go through the scenario. So option number one, the government pays back the money. Well, I'm here to tell you, if you haven't already heard, that the government is in debt, big time. 38 trillion actually just hit just a couple days ago. So that's not a real option. The government can't pay back money. Okay. So option number two, they can't default because then the entire economy will collapse, right? So what's the third option that's unique just to our government, or not our government, but all governments worldwide? Is they print what they're missing, right? And of course, if we were to do that, it would be called counterfeiting, right? So it's highly illegal for us to do that, but our government can. And this is a bit of an analogy, so walk with me here. It might not seem obvious at first, but okay, I'm on a diet. I used to eat 6 slices of pizza, and now I eat 3. Now this seems funny, obviously, because we can see it's the same amount of pizza, right? So if we play that in reverse, we can apply that to inflation, okay? So when the government prints new money, they aren't creating any extra value, okay? So you can think that the pizza stays the same, they're just cutting that pizza into more pieces, okay? So that's why I like to use this analogy. So, when the government's printing money, they aren't contributing their time and their energy into making that new money, they're just making it out of thin air. And that can be said even for when it's printed physically. So, I worked with AI a little bit to get to this little conclusion here, but it costs the government about 13 cents to print a $100 bill, if that puts it into perspective. But if they're to print it digitally, it's just numbers on a screen, obviously that doesn't have any real cost to them. So our money is broken, and when I say our money, this really does apply to all currencies globally. So it's not something that's unique to the United States, but you might be pleased to know that the US dollar is kind of like the cleanest shirt in the dirty laundry, okay? So even though it is subject to inflation, it's kind of like the least of the issues there. So some other currencies worldwide, like in Venezuela, their inflation rate is about 200% a year. And of course, in the United States, if you're listening to the CPI report, it'll tell you that our inflation is around 3%. Really, from my perspective, it's closer to 10%, but again, hey, it's not 200, right? So we're doing okay. But, and this is the debt for the US government, And I kind of just equate these, just for the simplicity of this presentation, we'll just equate debt to money printing. It's a little bit more complex than that. It's actually a lot more complex than that. It's extremely confusing. So just for the sake of argument, we'll basically just equate debt to money printing. And as you can see here, it actually has nothing to do with who's in political power. So this is actually an issue that stems way farther back, and we'll get into that, but it's basically a snowball rolling down a hill where it cannot be stopped, and it has nothing to do with who's in power, it has nothing to do with the policies. This is just a very big problem. And so I say here, it's not if, but when it will fail. Other currencies around the world, other fiat currencies as they're called, have failed in the past. And this is all of the different paper monies that you see here are all known as fiat currencies. And so fiat literally means by decree. It means that someone is saying this is the money, and it is the money because we say it is, right? So there's actually nothing backing our dollars as in the past, except our government saying this is our money. And going back to that concept of no value being created, if printing pieces of paper created wealth, then Zimbabwe would have been the richest country in the whole world. And these agro checks that you see here, you can see this is $100 billion on a piece of paper. I mean, can you imagine that in US dollars? That'd be insane, right? But this was a currency that hyperinflated away to nothing in just a matter of a couple of years. So in 2008, these were super popular. In 2009, it had already collapsed, and they were bringing in a new currency. So again, printing money does not create value. And so this is another look at the dollar. So this is kind of opposite to the last chart we just showed. So this is the purchasing power of a dollar. So I think back to my great-grandfather saying, I used to pay a quarter for a gallon of gas. Or I think back to my grandfather saying, I bought my house for $11,000, right? And now today, that $11,000 house is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000. So did my grandpa's house just magically become 8 times more valuable? No, okay? They've done some renovations, but really it's that the dollar has lost most of its value, and that it takes more of those worthless dollars to buy the same goods and the same services, okay? And actually this year is very special in a bad way. So you can see here this red line on the right. This is actually one of the worst years for the dollar ever. So we're experiencing some bad inflation. And again, in my view, it will just continue to get worse and worse as the dollar becomes worthless. So let's take a look at some other forms of money. So I'm going to kind of breeze through these a little bit, but it's important to know that money is not paper, okay? There were other forms of money before we had our dollars. So all across West Africa, they were using glass beads as money. Now, there were some pros and cons to this. So one pro of using the glass beads as money is that they were a hard money, meaning that they were hard to create more of. So glass making was difficult, and it was rare. Not everybody and their mother would make glass beads. So there wasn't a huge supply of them, right? They were scarce, okay? Now, something else that the glass beads had going for them were that they were divisible in a way. So you could have an entire necklace, or you could just take off a couple different beads. And these could be used to trade for anything from food to clothing, etc. So the big downfall of this form of money was that Europeans came in and said, hey, these people are using glass beads as money. I'm going to go back to Europe, I'm going to get some glass beads, and I'm going to come back, right? And they basically destroyed the economy. And that's all because of the supply, right? They introduced a lot of new supply. And the same sort of thing basically happened in North America with wampum shells. So the Native Americans would use these seashells basically as money. And not just any seashell, these were the hard to find, beautiful, scarce seashells, right? So the ones that you would just find all over the beach, they wouldn't make a good money. And it's kind of like intuitively we can know in our heart, in our mind, like why we don't use blades of grass as money, right? They're super easy to grow more of. Everybody has as many as they want. So, the North Americans honed in on a very specific and special seashell. And similarly to the glass beads, Europeans came in and said, oh, these people are using these wampum shells, and with better boats and better technology, they were able to harvest them from the sea, where normally the natives would have to find them on the coast. So they basically tapped into an unknown supply and destroyed the value. So gold, historically speaking, was the best money that humans found, okay? And I want that to sink in a little bit, because there's still a lot of people today that think that gold is the best money, and that's fine, they can have that opinion, but again, this is the best money that humans found, okay? So it was a very hard money, just like the seashells, just like the glass beads, where it's hard to make more of. Gold has to be located, has to be mined, refined, and then minted into the coins or the gold bars, right? Another positive thing about gold is that it's a commodity, right? So it's found on Earth. There's no central party that controls gold. You just find it. It's very divisible. It's very durable. It doesn't rust over time. And this word that some people might not know, fungible. So fungible means if I had one gold bar over here and I had one gold bar over here, they are the same, right? So dollars are fungible. Artwork, not fungible, right? If I paint two paintings, even if I try my very, very best to make the same thing twice, it's not going to be identical, so it's not fungible. So gold is fungible in that way. It can be boiled down and minted once again, and it's still a gold bar. So there are some cons that come with gold, though, as money. First off, the supply of gold globally increases by 1.5% to 2% every single year. And that 2% might ring a bell that the Fed is always saying that we'd like to target a 2% inflation rate for the dollar. But actually, when you have the supply increasing at just 2% a year, it actually means that the global supply doubles in just 36 years. So you can see here I have the range of 1.5% to 2%, so it's about 40 years for the supply to double. Additionally, for many years in the United States, it was illegal to own gold. So in 1933, we said, if you have gold, you have to surrender it to the government. And then finally, that ban was lifted in 1974, just a few years after we divorced ourselves from the gold standard. Kind of weird coincidence there. Another con to gold is that it's very expensive to transport and very expensive to protect. And sometimes I would say impossible. If you try to board a plane with $1 million of gold in your luggage, they would tell you no. You would not you would not be allowed to fly with that amount of gold. But if you are trying to protect large sums of gold, you need armored trucks, you need security guards, you need big vaults, things of that nature, so that someone can't just take that from you. So, one last thing on gold and sound money. I just want to give you guys a little bit of context for what sound money means and where that comes from. So in medieval times, kings, very much like our government today, were saying, how can we make more money without finding more gold? This finding gold thing, refining, it's very expensive. It takes a lot of time and energy, and I don't want to contribute that. So what can I do? So the medieval kings would actually mix their gold and silver coin with other metals. So you can see the copper nose coin down here in the bottom right. So this was Henry VIII's silver coin that actually had copper in it, and so it was silver plated. And after being in people's pockets and things of that nature, the silver would rub off his nose, and that's where the term copper nose came from. And what's interesting is that people in medieval times were able to distinguish between a perfectly normal silver or gold coin and one that had mixed metals, because when they knocked it on a surface, it would have this ring to it if it was perfect gold or perfect silver. Whereas if it was a mixed metal, it would kind of make this thud sound. And so when we say that something is a sound investment or a sound decision, that's actually where that term comes from. And I find that very interesting. So one concept that I want to share is that hard money is relative. So when the entire world was capitalizing on gold, China actually decided to capitalize on silver instead. And gold and silver coins, we like to group these two things together. Just how I shared that gold's supply increases at about 2% a year, silver's supply increases at about 10% a year. So that it makes it an easier money than gold. And so when China decided to capitalize on silver, just over a period of 12 years, they lost 30% of their purchasing power by deciding to hold silver instead of gold. And so they were worse off for it. So the key takeaway there is that you can ignore the hardest money, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring the hardest money. And that brings us to my favorite thing, which is Bitcoin. So just in case you want a little bit of knowledge about Bitcoin, it actually has an anonymous creator known as Satoshi Nakamoto. And so this is basically like a conceptual depiction of Satoshi. And some people say that Satoshi is all of us. So you can kind of see right through him at one angle, and then from this 3/4 angle, you can see a man working on a laptop, or woman. And so if you saw in today's art dispo, I had a 3D printed version of this on the table. And we're not going to get into the technicals really of Bitcoin because, again, I think it takes about 100 hours to really understand this topic. And so I don't want to bore everyone with technical jargon, but I just want to show that Bitcoin actually took about 35 years of technical innovation to finally come to fruition. I'll just point out one of my favorite ones, which is this highest pink dot, the second highest pink dot, which is Adam Back's Hashcash. So Adam Back was creating a way to send email around and verify that everyone that was sending email had basically worked for it. So he was trying to prevent spam. That's my understanding. And so he created what's known as proof of work. And we'll touch on this a little bit here. Again, I don't want to get too far into specifics, but Satoshi Nakamoto wrote this white paper, as it's called, and it was titled A Peer-to-Peer Electronic Cash System. So if we just break down that sentence right away. Peer-to-peer, meaning that there are no intermediaries. So Satoshi said that the biggest problem with our economic system today is all of the trust that it requires to work. So Katie, I'll use you again as a volunteer here. So if I'm gonna send Katie a wire transfer, right? I have to go to my bank and initiate this, and I'm gonna trust that my bank is going to initiate that. Then my bank has other payment processors, and in the examples of credit cards, debit cards, things like that, there are things like MasterCard, Visa, Amex, right? All these other third parties that are involved. And we're just trusting that at each link of the chain, they're gonna, do the right thing, and eventually the money will reach Katie. Electronic, of course, meaning that it's something that's digital. Something that's important about that is that it's not subject to physical risk. So a lot of people use real estate as money, right? They invest in real estate and plan to sell it later for a profit, but a house can get hit by a hurricane, someone can slip and fall on your doorstep and sue you. There's all sorts of other risks, like the local government can change their tax rules, right? And then the deal doesn't work out for you the same way that you thought it would. So there's a lot of risk with something being physical. And finally, just the word cash, meaning that it's a bearer asset. So he who holds it owns it, right? It's that simple. If I'm gonna give Katie a $20 bill, Katie owns it now, right? That's how that works. So another thing to know about Bitcoin is that it is a publicly distributed, decentralized ledger of transactions. So if you open a bank account, you go to the bank and say, here's $100, they don't actually hold your $100 for you, right? They just throw it in their vault and they say, okay, Nick gave me $100. If I write a check for $50, they say minus 50. Okay, Nick only has $50 left. That's a ledger system, and that's what Bitcoin is. So it's decentralized, meaning that every single computer on the Bitcoin network has the same full copy of every single transaction that's ever happened, okay? And so this basically makes it impossible to falsify a transaction. So it's a system of truth, and it's actually secured by energy. And when I say secured by energy, I mean that it is the most powerful computer network on our planet. And when I say that it's the most powerful computer network on Earth, just to put it into perspective, if you were to take all of the cloud computing resources of Amazon, Google, and Microsoft and combine them, and again, that's 60% of the internet, that would not even equate to 1% of the power that backs the Bitcoin network. So in order to hack the Bitcoin network, if we're bringing it back to that kind of question, you would need to bring online something that is more powerful than all of the existing Bitcoin computers. And so from my perspective, it's impossible. I mean, right, anything's possible, I suppose, but if you had that much computing power, it would actually be more in your interest to contribute to the existing network than it would be to try to fight it. It's kind of like, why don't we have two internets, right? We have one internet for a reason. It wouldn't make any sense to have two like competing internets. It wouldn't really make sense for anyone to try to bring online an even more powerful network and attack Bitcoin. It would really just be in their interest to contribute. And so just to bring this kind of back to the first slide, how does one earn Bitcoin, or how is Bitcoin created? It's actually by devoting a computer's time and energy, right? These concepts that I brought up in the very beginning, you go to work, you spend your time and your energy, you get money, and it works very much the same on the Bitcoin network. And I'll also say that it's been operating for 17 years without being broken. And that's not for a lack of trying. Certainly world governments and other nefarious actors have tried to break Bitcoin, but they can't. And so this is the issuance schedule for Bitcoin, and this is the equation that governs it. And again, I'm not going to get too far into the technical details here, but I just want to point out that every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that gets created gets cut in half, and half, and half. So this creates this line that's approaching an asymptote. And so 21 million is the forever supply of Bitcoin. There will never ever be more than 21 million Bitcoin. So I'm only certain of two things in life, that I'll die and that there will only be 21 million Bitcoin. That's really the only two things that I can count on. And so today we're approaching 20 million. So there's only about 5% of the supply left to be created. And so the important takeaway here is that money, as we know it, the US dollar is infinite, right? We have a scarce resource of gold, which again was the best money that we found. But Bitcoin is fixed, okay? So it is the only asset on Earth whose supply is completely inelastic to demand. So if the entire world woke up to the truth of Bitcoin tomorrow and all scrambled to get their hands on some, we can't create anymore, right? So there's 60 million millionaires on Earth, and there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, okay? If all of the 60 million millionaires wanted one, they all couldn't have one to themselves.
Why is 21 million the magic number?
Right, so Satoshi, when he was creating Bitcoin, kind of just landed on that number as he estimated it would kind of work out the best. It's arbitrary, so it could have been 30 million, it could have been 40 million, it could have been 10, honestly. But it's all governed by this equation. So starting from the first halving, so the computer speak, we start at 0. So starting at the first halving and going all the way to the 32nd halving, after 210,000 blocks get added to the chain, we're going to cut the supply in half. Okay, so each time that this 2 goes up a power, we're cutting the issuance in half. So in the very beginning, the block reward was 50 Bitcoin. After 4 years, it gets cut in half to 25, cut in half again, cut in half again. And so we are here today. So every 10 minutes, a new block gets added to the chain, and 3.125 Bitcoin are created every 10 minutes. And so that's 450 a day in today's halving cycle. But in the next halving cycle, so after, almost when we hit 2029, instead of 450 Bitcoin being created each day, only 225 will get created each day, and so on and so forth. So it's arbitrary, but it's locked in, it's permanent. That is the rule of the game, and it can't change. And so that is really important. And I just want to share for those who aren't really familiar with Bitcoin, if you have $1, it can get broken into 100 pieces that we call a cent or a penny, right? So one Bitcoin is actually comprised of 100 million Satoshis, they're called. Again, named after the anonymous creator. So it goes to the 8th decimal point. So in today's dollar terms, you can put any amount of money into Bitcoin and it will divide into a perfect number of Satoshis because one penny can buy many Satoshis today. So I just want to share that. You don't need to have $110,000 of today's money to get into Bitcoin. You can start with $10, $5, any amount of money. You don't need to have 100,000. And so we've talked about it being finite, divisible, unconfiscatable even. Something else that's important about Bitcoin is that it's consensus based. So, in today's world, the people who have the most money tend to make the rules, and that's not the case with Bitcoin. It doesn't matter how much you have. Your say in the network actually comes from running one of those computers, right? So if someone proposes a change in the rules, let's say 100% of the people on Earth are running the same version of the software, and someone over here says, well, I want this change to happen. Everyone else would have to adopt it for that to become the new rule set. So that's why I say that 21 million, it's set in stone and it can't change, and it's because it's a consensus-based system. Something else that's important is that it's permissionless. So if you go to the bank and say, hey, I want $50,000 of cash right now, they'll say, no, leave. Best we can do is 10 grand if you come back on Monday. No one can tell you that you can't send Bitcoin to someone else, so there's no permission required. We've talked about it being decentralized. Going back to the concept of it being a ledger system is that it's perfectly verifiable. So if you have a wallet address, you can know with certainty how much Bitcoin that wallet contains. And think of that as like a bank account when I say wallet. So it's perfectly verifiable. It's fair and equitable or egalitarian, meaning that it's the same rule set for everybody. So, in the fiat world, the people that are closest to the money printer, they tend to have sticky fingers, that sort of thing. That thing is not possible in Bitcoin. Everyone has the same rule set. And finally, again, it's global, fungible, meaning one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin. Durable, it can't rust, decay, or go bad, anything like that. And something important to know is that you're not late. And looking at the 5-year chart, it's up 865%, right? Well, I'm not here to talk to you today about its price performance over time, but over the last 5 years, it has averaged a 55% return. So that's really intriguing. And you might think, man, I missed it, right? Holy cow, there's no way it's going to do that again. But if you compare the adoption of Bitcoin to the adoption of the internet, we're actually at around the 2000 year level of adoption for the internet, right? So we're still very, very early is where I'm coming from there, right? If you think back to 2000, how many businesses were using internet, right? How many people had internet at their homes? We were very early, so we're still very early in the global adoption of Bitcoin. And just to kind of wrap things up, this is kind of on the concept of price performance, but this is comparing or pricing homes in Bitcoin instead of in dollars. So you can actually start on the right side here. You can see in each year, so 2017, 2021, and 2025, what the median home price in America was. And you can actually see between 2021 and 2025, it didn't change much. But over time, housing gets cheaper when priced in Bitcoin, right? So if you were to, let's just say you held 100 Bitcoin, and you waited, in this example, 8 years, you could buy 6 times the number of homes for that amount of Bitcoin. Another way to think about it, if you go back even further, back to 2011, the median home price in America in price in Bitcoin was 77,000 Bitcoin. Well, today, that's dropped closer to 4 Bitcoin. And so this is a bigger concept that I don't have pictures on, but everything tends to zero when priced in Bitcoin. And this is one of the last slides here. I just want to share that a very big person in the financial space, Frederick August Hayek, basically predicted Bitcoin back in 1984. He said, "I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of the government. That is, we can't take it violently out of the hands of the government. all we can do is by some sly roundabout way introduce something they can't stop. And so I just say, don't invest in Bitcoin, save in Bitcoin. It's a savings technology, in my opinion. You know, you don't try to make more money by buying Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the money. Okay, so that's my paradigm shift. And don't wait to buy Bitcoin. Buy Bitcoin and wait. And this is my final slide here. It's kind of a little bit silly. And again, this is not financial advice, right? The big thing here is to study Bitcoin. So again, it takes about 100 hours to really trust it and appreciate it, but I think it's something very important for everyone to do. So thank you very much for hearing me out. Thank you.